Welcome to Fairy Tales and Bedtime Stories. Today's story is Snow White. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far away, there lived a beautiful princess named Snow White. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. Snow White's beauty was renowned throughout the land. In the same kingdom there was a queen, Snow White's stepmother. She was very beautiful too, but she was also extremely vain. Every day, the queen would stand before her magical mirror and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" For many years the mirror always answered, "You, my queen, are the fairest in the land." This pleased the queen greatly, as she knew that her magical mirror could speak only the truth. However, as Snow White grew older, she became more and more beautiful. One day when the queen asked her mirror the usual question, the mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, it's true, but Snow White is fairer than you." The queen was shocked and became green with envy. From that moment, she hated Snow White more than anything in the world. She began to plot against her. Unable to bear the thought of someone being more beautiful than her, the queen summoned her royal huntsman. She gave him a sinister order: take Snow White into the forest and bring back her heart as proof of her death. The huntsman, shocked by the cruel command, led Snow White deep into the forest. But as he drew his knife, he looked into Snow White's innocent eyes and found he could not do it. "Run away, dear princess. Run and never come back," he whispered. Snow White, frightened and confused, ran deeper into the forest. As she ran, the sounds of the forest grew louder, and the night seemed to close in around her. Meanwhile, the huntsman returned to the queen with a deer's heart. The queen, thinking it was Snow White's heart, felt satisfied that she was once again the fairest in the land. However, deep in the forest, Snow White was still alive, beginning a new chapter of her life, filled with both wonder and uncertainty. Lost and alone, Snow White wandered through the dense forest. The trees seemed to whisper, and the shadows danced around her. Tired, scared, and hungry, she stumbled upon a tiny cottage, hidden amongst the trees. With hope flickering in her heart, she approached the cottage and knocked softly, but there was no answer. Snow White, curious and desperate for shelter, pushed the door open. Inside, she found a small, cozy room with 7 little chairs, 7 little beds, and 7 little plates on the table. Everything was neat, but incredibly small. Realizing that no one was home and too tired to go any further, Snow White decided to rest. First, she ate a few small bites of food from each plate and drank a drop of wine from each little glass. Then, she tried each bed until she found one that was just right. Exhausted, she fell asleep. As night fell, the owners of the cottage returned. They were 7 dwarfs who mined for precious gems in the mountains. To their surprise, they found the lights on, their dinner eaten, and their beds disturbed. Stealthily, they moved towards the bedroom and found Snow White asleep. At first, the dwarfs were shocked and confused. But as they watched her sleep, they saw her gentle face and decided to let her rest. When Snow White woke up, she was startled to see the 7 dwarfs staring at her. Quickly, she explained her story about her stepmother, the huntsman, and her flight through the forest. The dwarfs, moved by her story, agreed to let Snow White stay with them in exchange for her help with cooking and cleaning. Snow White was overjoyed and grateful. She had found new friends and a new home. The dwarfs warned Snow White that her stepmother was wicked and that she should never let anyone in while they were away. Snow White promised to be careful, and the dwarfs left for the mines each day, feeling a bit more cheerful with Snow White around. Thus, Snow White's life in the forest began. She took care of the cottage, sang with the birds, and waited for her new friends each evening. Despite her hardships, Snow White found happiness in the little cottage with the 7 dwarfs, and life seemed peaceful. The queen discovered that Snow White was still alive. Enraged, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She planned to disguise herself and deceive Snow White. Her first disguise was an old peddler woman. Disguised as the peddler, the queen approached Snow White with a beautiful lace bodice. But the lace was a dangerous trap. Snow White accepted the gift, and the queen quickly laced it up tightly. Snow White found herself unable to breathe and collapsed. Thinking Snow White was dead, the queen left, satisfied. Fortunately, the dwarfs returned in time and cut the lace, reviving Snow White. They warned her to be more cautious and not to trust strangers. But the queen, using her mirror, found out Snow White was still alive. Furious, she planned a second attempt. This time, she disguised herself as a different old woman. She offered Snow White a beautifully crafted comb. Snow White, charmed by the gift, accepted it and used it. The comb was poisoned. Once again, Snow White fell into a deep sleep, and once again the dwarfs came to her rescue, removing the comb. They begged Snow White to be even more careful. The queen, relentless, learned from her mirror that Snow White had survived again. Determined to succeed, she prepared her most dangerous plan yet. She disguised herself as a farmer's wife and took a poisoned apple with her. Snow White, despite the dwarf's warnings, was tempted by the apple. The queen cunningly offered her a taste. As soon as Snow White bit into the apple, she fell into a deep, unbreakable sleep. The queen, believing she had finally succeeded, left triumphantly. When the dwarfs found Snow White, they were heartbroken. They realized that this time they couldn't revive her. Snow White lay motionless, as if frozen in time. The dwarfs, grieving, could not bring themselves to bury her. Instead, they built a glass coffin, placing Snow White inside. They placed the coffin in a clearing in the forest. Every day, they kept watch, mourning their lost friend. Snow White looked as if she were merely sleeping, still as beautiful as ever. Meanwhile, the queen returned to her castle. She stood before her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who now is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." Satisfied at last, the queen's heart was filled with a triumphant joy. But her triumph was short-lived. Far in the forest, a prince was passing through. The prince came upon the glass coffin and saw Snow White lying there. Struck by her beauty and the sadness of her fate, he felt a deep compassion. He asked the dwarfs if he could take her to his castle, hoping to give her a proper resting place. The dwarfs, moved by the prince's sincerity, agreed. As his servants carried the coffin, they stumbled, jostling the coffin. This dislodged the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat. To everyone's astonishment, Snow White coughed, blinked, and slowly sat up. She was alive. The poison had lost its power. The dwarfs rejoiced, and the prince was overjoyed. Snow White looked into the prince's eyes and saw kindness and warmth. The prince asked her to come with him to his kingdom. Grateful and filled with new hope, Snow White agreed. As they departed, the dwarfs waved goodbye, tears of joy in their eyes. Snow White promised to visit them and always keep them in her heart. Thus, a new chapter began for Snow White, one of hope and new beginnings.